The room was closed to daylight, windows shuttered, door barred against intruders. Women moved in dim candlelight, their voices low, urgent. At the center, a woman sat on a wooden stool shaped like a crescent moon, her body straining, sweat soaking her shift. The midwife knelt before her, hands ready, eyes watching for the crown of the baby's head or the first sign that something was going terribly wrong. This was the birthing room, a space where men never entered, where ancient knowledge passed between women, and where death waited as often as new life. So what exactly filled these rooms? What tools did midwives use? What rituals did they perform? And what separated a successful birth from a mother's funeral? Before we explore the tools and rituals of medieval birthing chambers, if you're fascinated by how women survived childbirth without modern medicine, hit the subscribe button and give a like. The birthing room was always a woman's space, exclusively female by law and custom. When labor began, the mother's female relatives, neighbors, and friends gathered. They were called the gossips, from godsibs or godsiblings, women who would witness the birth and later serve as godmothers. Men, including husbands and physicians, were strictly forbidden entry. This wasn't just tradition, it was enforced. A man who entered a birthing room faced public shaming and accusations of impropriety. Even male physicians, trained at universities, could only advise from outside the door, relying on the midwife's descriptions of what was happening inside. The room itself was typically the mother's own bedchamber, transformed for the occasion. The first step was closing it off from the outside world. Windows were shuttered and covered with heavy cloth to block light and drafts. Medieval theory held that fresh air and light were dangerous to laboring women, that they made the body vulnerable to evil spirits and illness. So the room became dark, stuffy, heated by a fire burning constantly in the hearth. The heat was oppressive, especially in summer, but it was considered necessary. The mother needed warmth to help the baby descend, or so they believed. Tapestries hung on walls to block drafts, doors were locked or barred. The space became a sealed chamber where only women's voices and the mother's cries could be heard. Here's where the essential equipment reveals itself. The birthing stool was the centerpiece of most medieval births. This was a low wooden seat, usually curved with a U-shaped opening in the center, allowing the midwife to access the birth canal from below while the mother remained upright. The design was ancient, used since Roman times, based on the correct understanding that gravity helped labor progress. The mother sat on the stool, her feet braced on the floor or on supports, her hands gripping handles or the arms of attendants on either side. This position opened the pelvis wider than lying down and allowed the baby to move downward naturally. The stool was typically plain, made by local carpenters, but some wealthy families owned elaborate versions with cushioned seats and carved decorations. More importantly, the stool was stained. Years of use left it marked with blood, amniotic fluid, and other birth fluids. These stains weren't cleaned away, they were considered proof of the stool's experience, evidence that many women had used it and survived. Some communities had a single birthing stool that passed from house to house, a shared tool that connected women across generations. Others kept family birthing stools, used by mothers, daughters, and granddaughters, accumulating history with each birth. The midwife's bag contained her essential tools, and examining it shows the mix of practical knowledge and desperate hope that defined medieval childbirth. Sharp knives or scissors for cutting the umbilical cord after birth. These weren't medical instruments but ordinary household tools, wiped clean but not sterilized. Thread or thin strips of leather for tying off the cord once cut. Cloths, usually old linen sheets torn into strips for wrapping the newborn and absorbing blood. Oils and fats, typically rendered animal fat or expensive olive oil if the family could afford it, for massaging the mother's belly and lubricating the birth canal if the baby seemed stuck. Herbal preparations filled small bottles and pouches. Ergot, a fungal growth on rye, was used to strengthen contractions when labor stalled. It worked because ergot contains compounds that stimulate uterine muscles. Though medieval midwives didn't know the mechanism, they just knew it helped, and they used it carefully because too much caused dangerous hemorrhaging. Pennyroyal, rue, and tansy were kept ready in case the baby died in the womb and needed to be expelled. These herbs induced contractions and could be abortifacient, which made them controversial and dangerous, but midwives kept them because sometimes they were the only option. Prayer beads and holy relics completed the bag. A piece of saint's bone, a scrap of blessed cloth, or a written prayer sealed in wax were considered as essential as physical tools. The midwife placed these near the mother or had her touch them during labor, invoking divine protection against the very real possibility of death. Now the rituals and beliefs become clear. Medieval childbirth was as much spiritual as physical. The room was blessed before labor began. A priest might come to the threshold, not entering but sprinkling holy water toward the interior and speaking prayers. Saints were invoked constantly. Saint Margaret, patron saint of childbirth, was the most important. Her legend told of being swallowed by a dragon and bursting free, a symbolic rebirth that women hoped to emulate. Images of St. Margaret, paintings or small statues were placed in the birthing room. Women in labor held Margaret relics or wore girdles, long strips of parchment inscribed with prayers to the saint, wrapped around their bellies. These girdles were owned by churches and loaned to pregnant women, returned after birth or kept if the mother died. Some girdles were ancient, passed down for generations, their parchment worn soft and stained from countless labors. Eagle stones, hollow rocks that rattled when shaken, were tied to the mother's thigh. The belief was that the stone's hollow nature would help the womb open and release the baby. Amber, coral, and certain gemstones were thought to ease pain and protect against evil. Wealthy women wore these during labor. Poor women borrowed them if they could or did without. Every candle lit in the room was a prayer. Every psalm recited by the attending women was protection. The physical and spiritual blurred completely because both seemed equally necessary for survival. The midwife's knowledge was entirely experiential. She learned by apprenticing with an older midwife, attending births, watching, and eventually taking over when she'd seen enough. No books taught her. Most midwives were illiterate. Their knowledge was oral, passed mother to daughter or mentor to apprentice. They learned to recognize normal labor, the steady progression of contractions, the stages of cervical dilation that they assessed by inserting fingers into the birth canal, the crowning of the baby's head. They learned the positions that helped, encouraging mothers to squat, kneel, or walk during early labor, then sit on the birthing stool when birth was imminent. They knew how to turn a baby that presented wrong, reaching into the womb to grasp a foot and rotate the child so it came head first instead of feet or shoulder first. This maneuver, called version, was agonizing for the mother and dangerous for both, but sometimes it worked. They learned when to wait and when to intervene, though their interventions were limited and often fatal. Don't miss this crucial reality. Many births went wrong, and the midwife's options were horrifying. If the baby was stuck, truly stuck with the head lodged in the birth canal, and not moving despite hours of pushing, the midwife faced an impossible choice. She could try to pull the baby out using hooks, sharp metal instruments that she inserted alongside the baby's head to grip the skull and pull. This often killed the baby and frequently tore the mother's tissues, causing hemorrhaging or infection that killed her days later. Or she could perform embryotomy, cutting the baby apart inside the womb to remove it piece by piece. This was done when the baby was already dead or clearly wouldn't survive, and it was the only way to save the mother's life. The midwife used knives to decapitate the baby, then extracted the head separately from the body. The trauma to the mother was immense, physical and psychological, and infection almost always followed. Most mothers who underwent embryotomy died within a week, but without it they died in labor, so the choice was between certain death and probable death. Midwives who performed these procedures carried the weight of it for life. They killed babies to try to save mothers, and often both died anyway. Class shaped the birthing experience profoundly. Noble women gave birth in castle chambers prepared for weeks in advance. Multiple midwives attended, the most experienced brought from distant cities if necessary. Physicians stood outside, ready to advise though they couldn't enter. The room was furnished with the best birthing stool, fine linens, imported herbs, and every possible comfort. Yet noble women died in childbirth at rates similar to peasants, because wealth couldn't overcome the fundamental dangers. Rich and poor alike faced hemorrhage, obstructed labor, and infection. The difference was in dignity and memory. A noble woman who died in childbirth was mourned publicly, buried with ceremony, her name recorded. A peasant woman died and was buried quickly, often forgotten except by her family. For poor women, the birthing room was cramped, dirty, and minimally equipped. The midwife might be a village woman with limited experience. The attending gossips were neighbors who'd rather be working. There was no spare linen, no expensive oils, no imported herbs. The fire might not be lit because fuel was expensive. The birthing stool might be a borrowed chair with a hole cut in the seat. And if something went wrong, there were fewer options and less hope. Poor women died more often because complications that required intervention, embryotomy, emergency care, were handled by less skilled midwives with worse tools in worse conditions. Here's the surprising strength these rooms witnessed. Women supported each other through unimaginable pain with a solidarity that men never saw. The attending gossips weren't just witnesses. They held the mother upright when her strength failed. They wiped her face, gave her sips of ale or wine, spoke encouragement when she wanted to give up. They sang hymns and told stories to distract her between contractions. They prayed together, their voices joining in rhythmic chants that filled the dark room. When the baby finally came, they wept with relief. When the mother died, they washed her body and prepared it for burial, weeping then too, but also ensuring she was treated with respect. This network of female support was essential to survival, not just physically but emotionally. Labor could last days. Women couldn't endure that alone. The presence of other women, the knowledge that others had survived this, the physical touch and spoken comfort, made the unbearable slightly more bearable. After birth, assuming mother and baby survived. The room remained sealed for a period of lying in, typically lasting a month. The mother stayed in bed, recovering, while the gossips and female relatives cared for her and the newborn. Men still couldn't enter. This was the woman's domain, and she needed rest away from household duties and male demands. The midwife visited daily to check healing, to ensure the womb was contracting properly, to treat any complications. Hemorrhaging was common in the days after birth. The midwife packed the vagina with cloth soaked in vinegar, or applied pressure to the abdomen, hoping to stop bleeding that could kill in hours. Infection, called childbed fever, was the other major killer. It usually began 3 to 5 days after birth, when the mother developed fever, foul-smelling discharge, and abdominal pain. Medieval healers didn't know bacteria caused it. They attributed it to bad air or retained birth matter. They treated it with herbal drinks and prayers, which did nothing. Most women with childbed fever died, their bodies consumed by an infection that modern antibiotics could cure in days. The lying-in period ended with churching, a church ceremony that purified the woman and allowed her to rejoin public life. This ritual acknowledged that childbirth was dangerous, polluting, and transformative. The woman who emerged from the birthing room wasn't the same one who entered. The midwife's social position was complex. She was essential, trusted with the most intimate and dangerous moments of women's lives. Yet she was also feared, and sometimes accused of witchcraft, especially if many of her patients died. A midwife with a bad reputation, too many deaths, too many stillbirths, could be investigated by church authorities. If she'd performed emergency baptisms on dying infants, she might be accused of heresy if the rituals weren't done correctly. If she'd used herbs to speed labor or ease pain, she might be accused of dark magic. Some midwives were executed as witches, their knowledge of female bodies and birth seen as dangerous, unnatural, threatening to male religious authority. Yet communities couldn't function without midwives. Women would die without them. So midwives existed in this precarious space, honored and suspected, needed and feared. They took oaths before church authorities, swearing to perform baptisms properly, to not use forbidden herbs, to call a priest if death seemed imminent. These oaths acknowledged the church's anxiety about midwives' power, but also their necessity. By the late medieval period, some written texts on childbirth appeared, though they were rare and mostly inaccessible to midwives. Trotula, a collection of medical texts possibly written by or attributed to a female physician in Salerno, contained advice on pregnancy, labor, and postpartum care. It described positions for birth, treatments for complications, and herbal remedies. But Trotula was in Latin, later translated into vernacular languages, and few midwives could read. The knowledge in texts like these influenced university-trained physicians, but rarely reached the women actually delivering babies. Practical midwifery remained oral, learned by doing, passed from experienced hands to novice ones. The gap between written medical knowledge and practical care persisted for centuries, and women suffered because of it. The medieval birthing room was a space of contradictions, dark yet filled with life-giving energy, silent to the outside world, yet filled with women's voices, a place of hope and terror, survival and death, ancient knowledge and desperate improvisation. Every birth that happened in these rooms was a gamble, and the women who entered knew it. They prepared for death as much as for new life, making wills, confessing sins, saying goodbyes just in case. The midwife who presided over this space carried impossible responsibility. She held 2 lives in her hands with tools that barely worked and knowledge built on trial and error. Sometimes she succeeded, bringing baby and mother through safely, and the gossips celebrated. Sometimes she failed, and she buried both, carrying the guilt even when nothing she did could have changed the outcome. The birthing room was where women's strength was tested beyond anything men experienced in battle or labor, and the women who survived it, who walked out carrying their babies, had endured a trial that marked them forever. If you enjoy the hidden sides of medieval life, hit subscribe and give this video a like.